My twin brother showed up at my door covered in bruises. His wife's brothers had been assaulting him for a year, so we switched places, and I made sure they'd never repeat it. All right, Reddit. My identical twin brother arrived at my apartment last year looking like he'd been dragged through a battlefield. It turned out his wife's brothers had been treating him like a punching bag for over 12 months. He asked me to switch places with him so he could get away and recover. I agreed and spent 7 weeks living through the same abuse while documenting every moment. Then I invited those men to dinner and watched the consequences unfold. Here's what happened. I'm Nathan, 32, male, a civil engineer for a construction firm in Seattle. Solid career, own my condo, drive a reliable truck, overall a steady, simple life. My twin brother Ethan and I are identical in every way. Same height, build, and facial features, even the tiny scar above our left eyebrow from a childhood bike accident. Growing up, we constantly swapped places, switching classes in high school, and confusing relatives at family gatherings. Our parents always knew who was who, but most people couldn't tell us apart unless they looked closely. We stayed close through college and adulthood, even as our careers went in different directions. Ethan went into marketing. He met his wife Kristen at a company event about 5 years ago. They married fast and later had a daughter, Sophie, who just turned 4. I was his best man. I remember him smiling non-stop that day. He looked genuinely happy. Good job, loving family, nice suburban home. Everything seemed normal, which is why what happened that Tuesday evening in March was such a shock. I was at my kitchen table reviewing blueprints for a commercial build when I heard the knock. It wasn't a confident knock from a friend or the quick tap of a delivery driver. It sounded hesitant, like the person outside wasn't sure they belonged there. I set down my coffee and walked to the door with a strange sense of unease settling in my chest. When I opened it, I didn't recognize the person at first. Not because he didn't look like me, we're identical, but because he looked hollowed out. His posture was collapsed, shoulders slumped, head lowered. When he finally looked up, I saw the bruises. These weren't the kind you get from bumping into furniture. They were intentional. A dark purple bruise covered his left cheekbone, fading into yellow and green around the edges. His bottom lip was split and crusted with dried blood. He winced every time he shifted, holding his ribs carefully, like any movement might make things worse. His knuckles were scraped raw, and his eyes, he looked haunted. Not even when we were kids dealing with the aftermath of losing our mom did I ever see that expression on him. This was the look of someone worn down over a long period. I stepped aside automatically, holding the door open. Ethan walked in like a ghost who didn't belong anywhere. I closed the door, locked it, and turned toward him. He stood in my living room with his arms wrapped around himself, staring at the floor. Silence stretched on until I finally said his name. He flinched, something I'd never seen him do, and it sent a cold wave of fear through me. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer immediately. He sat on the edge of the couch, moving carefully as if everything hurt. He leaned forward, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, rough and worn. "It's Kristen's brothers," he said, "Blake and Craig." My stomach dropped. I knew them. Loud, dominating guys who took over every room, talked over people, and acted like they owned everything. Blake was around 35, worked in construction management. Craig was about 30, in sales. Both were the type who were used to being unchallenged. I'd always thought they were annoying and overbearing, but this was something completely different. For the next 2 hours, Ethan told me everything. The story came out in pieces, his voice shaking, hands trembling as he recounted the past year. "It started small," he said. "A shove here, a rude joke there. Always brushed off as rough teasing. They mocked him at family dinners, belittled his career, called him weak and unmanly. Sometimes Kristen laughed along. Sometimes she said nothing at all, which in some ways was worse. Ethan thought it would pass. He believed if he ignored it, stayed polite, and tried to prove himself, they'd eventually back off. But things escalated. They began showing up uninvited, walking into the house like they owned it, taking food, changing the channel, letting Ethan know he had no control in his own home. When Kristen wasn't around, they tested him more directly. One night, about 6 months ago, Blake shoved Ethan against a wall when he asked them to leave because Sophie was asleep upstairs. Ethan tried to hold his ground. That's when the first serious beating happened. They cornered him in the garage. Craig held him while Blake hit him. Calm, methodical, like he was teaching a lesson. They ordered him not to tell anyone. They said nobody would believe him anyway. They could ruin his reputation, claim he was unstable, and make sure he lost custody of Sophie. And because the family always defended Blake and Craig, Ethan knew they could do it. He endured the threats, the beatings, and the constant humiliation. The abuse became frequent. Blake would show up whenever he felt like it. Craig would join in on weekends. They focused on injuries that could be hidden, mostly body shots. Kristen noticed bruises, but accepted every excuse. Maybe she didn't want to look deeper. Maybe it was easier not to. The worst part, Ethan said, was when Craig used Sophie as leverage. Subtle comments about accidents, little reminders that custody favors the mother, suggestions that Ethan could lose his daughter if he didn't behave. "I'm scared all the time," he said, "of what they'll do, of what happens if I push back, of losing Sophie. I don't know how to get out." Then he looked at me with desperate, red-rimmed eyes and asked for help. "Not someday, right now." He said he needed to disappear briefly to figure things out and heal. But he couldn't just leave. Blake and Craig would retaliate or target Sophie. He needed someone to take his place temporarily. And because we're twins, and because nobody outside immediate family could tell us apart, he thought I could do it. A reasonable person might have said no. The plan was risky and borderline illegal. But looking at my brother, the bruises, the exhaustion, the fear, I couldn't send him back there alone. I couldn't leave him trapped. So I agreed. Not only would I take his place, but I planned to expose Blake and Craig. I'd gather evidence and dismantle their control. They wouldn't get away with it. Blake was a large man, around 6'2" and probably 220 pounds. Most of his size came from weightlifting, not functional strength. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been seriously confronted, someone used to getting away with bullying because he was bigger and louder than everyone else. "Rough day at the office, pushing papers?" he asked. I kept my eyes lowered, continuing the role Ethan had been forced into for over a year. "Just long. Lots of meetings." "Yeah, meetings." Blake laughed like he'd heard the best joke of the day. "Must be tough sitting in conference rooms talking about marketing strategies while real men do actual work." My crew poured the foundation for a 3-story office building today. Built something real, something that'll last. The message was obvious. Ethan's job didn't matter. His career was unimportant. He was less of a man because he didn't work a physically demanding job. It was the same pattern Ethan had described, the same script Blake used to assert control and make his brother-in-law feel small. I didn't respond. I focused on reheated casserole, keeping my posture passive. Blake slowly circled the kitchen island, stepping into my space, pushing me toward the counter. Ethan said this was always how it began, small tests meant to reinforce the hierarchy. "Kristen working late again?" Blake asked, already expecting the answer. "She'll be home around 7. "Good. Wouldn't want her seeing her husband acting like such a pathetic loser, right?" He shoved my shoulder. "Not enough to injure, but enough to intimidate." "You embarrass her. My sister deserves better than some soft marketing guy who can't stand up for himself. She could have married anyone, but she settled for you." The recorder in my pocket caught every word clearly. The camera hidden inside the kitchen clock showed Blake's posture, the way he closed in on me, his hand on my shoulder. I allowed him to continue his typical routine, taking the insults and maintaining the submissive body language he expected. Rounded shoulders, lowered gaze, and short, non-provocative responses. Blake spent about 20 minutes re-establishing his position. He criticized everything: the kitchen, the meal, my clothes, my stance, even my presence. Each comment was meant to break down confidence and reinforce the idea that Ethan was worthless, someone who should feel lucky Blake and Craig put up with him. When Kristen's car pulled into the driveway, Blake's attitude shifted instantly. He became cheerful, friendly, the concerned brother just checking in. He ruffled my hair, an action that looked affectionate, but was another subtle way of asserting dominance. "Good talk, champ," he said loudly as Kristen walked through the door. "Just making sure my sister's being taken care of. Family looks out for each other." Kristen smiled, either unaware of or deliberately ignoring what had happened. "Thanks for checking in, Blake. Want to stay for dinner?" "Nah, got plans. See you this weekend at Mom and Dad's." He gave me a sharp, silent warning as he left. After he was gone, I sat at the table with Kristen and Sophie, continuing the subdued routine Ethan had been forced into. Sophie talked about daycare, finger painting, and a classmate who had brought cookies. I responded as expected, keeping the act intact, while the recorder continued documenting everything. Later that night, once Kristen and Sophie were asleep, I reviewed the footage. It was excellent. Clear video of Blake's aggression and perfect audio capturing every insult and threat. I added it to the growing evidence folder, arranging everything by date to create a timeline that couldn't be ignored. This continued for 7 weeks. Blake visited twice a week, sometimes alone, sometimes with Craig. They walked in without knocking, insulted me, pushed me, and occasionally escalated to real violence. I recorded every insult, shove, and punch. The cameras captured every detail. Craig behaved differently from Blake. He wasn't as physically aggressive, but was far more calculated. He made threats involving Sophie and explained how easy it would be to paint me as an unfit parent. His comments revealed clear, intentional psychological manipulation. Around week 4, the violence increased. Blake arrived angry about something at work and took it out on me in the garage. Craig held my arms while Blake hit me, mostly body shots, though a few landed on my face. I let it happen, focusing on the recorder and the camera hidden in the ceiling. Kristen saw the bruises that night. I was in the bathroom inspecting them when she walked in. For a moment, I thought she might finally acknowledge what was happening. Instead, she sighed and said, "You need to be more careful." That response confirmed her role. She wasn't directly participating, but she was enabling the abuse through deliberate denial. She preferred the comfortable lie over a difficult truth. By week 6, I had dozens of hours of footage. Blake and Craig had assaulted me multiple times, made repeated threats, and shown a long-term pattern of abuse. I had enough evidence to take them down legally. I just needed the right moment. I planned it carefully. Kristen's parents were celebrating their 40th anniversary with a large family dinner. Everyone would be there. No escape for Blake and Craig, and plenty of witnesses. During our nightly call, I told Ethan the plan. He was hesitant, worried the situation might escalate, but I assured him this was the safest method. Public exposure, recorded proof, and immediate access to authorities. The night before the dinner, I assembled everything. A compilation video of the clearest footage, organized audio files, medical records, and photos of injuries. I saved copies to multiple USB drives, uploaded everything to secure cloud storage, and prepared packets for the police, Kristen's family, and Ethan's attorney. Yes, I had already hired one for him. Saturday evening, I arrived at Frank and Patricia's home with Kristen and Sophie. The house was packed with family and friends, around 40 people. Blake and Craig were already there, entertaining the room. When they saw me, Blake smirked and made a comment about me actually showing up. Craig whispered something to his friend, and they laughed. They had no idea. Dinner was typical. Too much food, loud conversations, and Frank telling stories while Patricia smiled. I stayed quiet, continuing the diminished persona they were used to. After dessert, Frank stood to thank everyone. When he finished, I stood as well. The room quieted. This wasn't expected. "I'd like to say something," I said, keeping my tone steady, mentioning family and the importance of protecting loved ones. Kristen gave me a tense look. Blake and Craig exchanged glances, expecting something embarrassing. I pulled out a small remote and pointed it at the TV. Earlier, I had asked Frank if I could show family photos, so the setup was already prepared. For the past 7 weeks, I began as the screen lit up. I've been documenting something happening in this family that everyone needs to see. The first video played. Blake walking into the house uninvited and immediately starting verbal attacks. The audio was clear. Every word was unmistakable. The room went silent. Patricia gasped. Frank's face darkened. Kristen turned pale. Blake stood up, but his father ordered him to sit. The compilation continued. Blake shoving me, Craig holding me during assaults, threats involving Sophie, and repeated intimidation. Everything was time-stamped with clear video. People started crying. Frank appeared overwhelmed. Blake and Craig froze, their expression shifting from disbelief to anger to fear. When the video ended, the silence was complete. I said, "Blake and Craig have been abusing Ethan for over a year. They've assaulted him, threatened him, and created an environment of fear in his own home, and everyone here allowed it to continue." Blake lunged from his chair, rage twisting his face. I repeated firmly, "Then explain the context where it's acceptable to hit your sister's husband and threaten a 4-year-old. Craig switched tactics, turning to his parents with urgency. "Dad, this is crazy. He's twisting everything. We were just what?" I cut in. "Just intimidating someone for a year? Just committing several crimes, assault, battery, threats, and trespassing, all of which I've documented and already reported?" That was when I revealed the next part of my plan. 2 uniformed officers stepped through the doorway. I had contacted them earlier, provided initial evidence, and they agreed to remain nearby during the dinner until I signaled. The officers approached Blake and Craig and informed them they were under arrest for assault, battery, criminal threats, and harassment. Blake started shouting about lawyers and false claims. Craig went silent, completely drained of color. Both were handcuffed as their parents watched in shock, while relatives stood frozen and Kristen cried in the corner. As they were being taken out, Blake glared at me with open hatred. "You'll pay for this. We'll ruin you in court. We'll take everything." I looked at him steadily. "You spent a year trying to destroy someone. You tried to make him feel powerless. But I'm not your victim anymore." He looked confused at that last part, but the officers pulled him away before he could respond. They were placed in patrol cars and driven off. The house fell quiet, except for Patricia crying softly and people shifting around, unsure what to do. I addressed the guests. "I think it's best if everyone leaves. If anyone wants copies of the evidence to understand what's been happening, I can provide them. Otherwise, please go." Most people hurried out, offering awkward apologies or avoiding eye contact entirely. Patricia stopped before leaving, tears running down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said. I didn't know they were doing this." I met her eyes and saw genuine shock. "Maybe you didn't know everything," I said. "But there were signs, moments where questions could have been asked, times when it was clear something was wrong. Those signs were there. Everyone chose not to see them." She cried harder and left with Frank, who still hadn't spoken. Soon, only Kristen and I remained. She sat on the couch, her face red and swollen. "How could you do this to my family?" she whispered. "We're going to lose everything because of you." I sat across from her, feeling the exhaustion settle in as the adrenaline finally wore off. "Kristen, your brothers abused your husband for over a year. They threatened your daughter. They turned your home into a place of fear, and you allowed it. You supported it by refusing to acknowledge what was happening. This isn't because of me. It's because of choices you and your brothers kept making." She shook her head. "They were just trying to protect me, make sure you were treating me right." I gave a short, humorless laugh. "Protecting you from what? From a husband who loved you? They weren't protecting you. They were controlling you, and they were abusing him. And you let them because it was easier than confronting them." I stood and told her that divorce papers would be filed within the week, that Ethan would seek sole custody of Sophie, and that she should find an attorney. She looked confused and started to ask something, and that was when I decided she needed the truth. "I'm not your husband," I said quietly. "I'm his twin brother, Nathan." I explained that Ethan had come to me 7 weeks earlier, bruised and terrified, asking me to switch places with him so he could recover. I told her I had been living in her home, taking the same abuse he had suffered, documenting it and building a case against Blake and Craig. Her face went through disbelief, shock, and finally realization. "Everything you've done to Ethan for the past year," I said, "you've spent the last 7 weeks doing to me. Every insult, every threat, every hit, I took it so he could escape and heal. Your husband is safe, and I've gathered everything needed to hold your brothers accountable." Something in her expression collapsed, and she started crying into her hands. I felt nothing. I told her I would stay in the house that night, but she should go to her parents' home. Then I went upstairs to the guest room. I heard her crying behind me, but I closed the door. It was over. They had walked into the trap exactly as planned. Everything from here on would follow its course: legal action, consequences, and rebuilding. I called Ethan at the cabin. He answered immediately, tense. I told him everything. The dinner, the evidence, the reactions, the arrests, and Kristen's role. He was silent for a long moment before breaking down into deep, relieved sobs. Thank you, he said. Thank you. I don't know how to repay you. You don't need to, I told him. You're my brother. I'd do it again without hesitation. Stay at the cabin a few more days while things settle. Then you can move into your new apartment. I had already helped arrange a one-bedroom unit across town, away from Kristen's family, where he could rebuild and have a safe place for Sophie during visits. We talked for a while, tired, overwhelmed, and still processing that it was truly over. When the call ended, I sat in the quiet room, feeling the bruises and exhaustion, and let myself breathe. The legal process took several months. Blake and Craig were charged with multiple felonies, second-degree assault, criminal threats, stalking, and harassment. The evidence was undeniable. Both accepted plea deals rather than missed trial. Blake received 18 months in county jail plus 3 years pro. Craig received 14 months plus probation. Both were ordered to stay away from Ethan and Sophie indefinitely. Ethan's divorce was finalized 4 months later. He was granted sole physical custody, and Kristen received supervised visitation. The judge made it clear that Ethan was the stable, protective parent, and that Kristen's enabling behavior was deeply concerning. Frank and Patricia later contacted Ethan, apologizing and expressing shame for their son's actions. Actions and their own refusal to see what was happening. They asked to remain in Sophie's life. Ethan agreed to supervised visits, recognizing their remorse and role as grandparents. As for me, I returned to my condo and my normal routine. The bruises healed, the soreness faded, but the experience left its mark. I understood now what it meant to feel truly vulnerable and trapped, unable to ask for help. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe. It helps the channel grow and allows us to bring you more stories like this. Thank you.